America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Alfredo Ortiz, CEO of Job Creators Network.
Please subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or anywhere you get your podcast from. If you want to watch the video of the podcast, you can see them on Rumble and YouTube, or you can go to our website, mainstreetmatters.com, and watch them from there. So, Alfredo, today we can talk a little bit about that announcement that the president made on Friday about the new workaround. He wants to forgive, $39 billion in student loans by fiat, by executive order. And it includes 800,000 borrowers. But I think I remember just 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You can't do that without congressional input. So what is happening here?
It's amazing. This is just another example of what the Biden administration just is pretty much honestly giving the middle fingers to the Supreme Court. I mean, that's what it really comes down to. People always ask, how much does a vote actually cost to buy? Well, it's really easy now. I can figure that out. It's $40 billion roughly, divided by 800,000 people. So that's about $50,000 per vote. So that's pretty much what votes now go for when you have to buy it. I guess it's Biden inflation.
Yeah, I mean, it is crazy that we went through all of this. Job Creators Network Foundation was one of the lawsuits that not only we won at the Texas district level and vacated the entire program, but went up to the Supreme Court along with the 6 AGs that banded together. And as we all know, our case may not have been selected by the Supreme Court to be upheld. It was dismissed on standing. But our case kept that money from going out the door when we won at the district level, so that the AG's case could finish the job and allow those justices to again tell this administration, hey, you can't just do whatever you want. You're not a king.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And so I don't think this is the last attempt of as a workaround to the Supreme Court ruling. So we'll see what he has in store for us. But hopefully we'll be able to stop this either in Congress or the Missouri AG. Hopefully will put a legal action forward to be able to try to stop this.
I mean, imagine if we all just decided, I don't really agree with what the court said, so I'm going to do whatever I want and find another way. I mean, it's ridiculous. And I was listening to the education secretary when he came out and made this announcement. And you know what he said that struck me was, we are always going to put borrowers first. Right. And I just thought, it's taxpayers that need to be put first. It's taxpayers that need to be protected. And it is the responsibility of this administration and every member in Congress to solve the problem, not to wallpaper over it at the expense of taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, this is vote buying. I mean, let's just get right down to it. I mean, it's exactly what happened with the midterms. And President Biden promised something that he couldn't deliver. He should have never promised it. And now they're just trying to figure out how to deliver that promise by breaking the law effectively. And so, again, hopefully the Missouri AG will do something about it. Or in Congress, I mean, last I checked, they have not done the education appropriations bill, has not actually hit the House floor. So hopefully they'll add some kind of amendment to that that will actually prevent Biden from doing this?
Well, he's got two more things up his sleeves, doesn't he? The first
Yes.
is they're going to go through, try and invoke that Higher Education Act of which basically forces them to go through negotiated rulemaking. It's a very long process. And he didn't want to go through it last fall because he wanted to get this done before the midterms. So now he's going to go through the long process. I think they set everyone's expectations. This is going to take a while, but they're going to try to go through it. I still think that whole I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but the major doctrines question that the Supreme Court keeps kicking around and keeps kind of using to stop that regulatory overreach is going to be the backstop here, even on the Higher Education Act, because it's so much money, $400 billion that he's still trying to forgive.
No, and the other thing though is that this actually, hopefully, like we actually had a podcast with Karen Harnett, our chief legal officer. This hopefully will, though, eventually really put a stop to this kind of administrative overreach. Quite frankly, for any president, whether it's a Republican or it's a Democrat, we can't just have presidents ruling by fiat.
And the other thing that he's doing is, of course, he had promised that payments were going to start up again. There have been no payments for 3 years throughout the pandemic, and that 60 days after the Supreme Court ruled, the payments would start. And then the debt deal that went through just about a month ago, I guess, also codified that promise that the payments would restart again. Is it September 1st or October 1st? I think it's
October 1st.
Okay. They've created an on-ramp restart for up to a year. So they want you to make your payments, but if you can't make your payments, there'll be no delinquency. There's no consequence to not making your payments. And so my guess is that the goal here is to basically stretch out that year while they make it through negotiated rulemaking. And their hope is that obviously they can do it through Higher Education Act, and then nobody will ever have to start making their payments again. Hey folks, Elaine Parker here from Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. A tree branch hit a power line in Ohio 2003, and it shut down 21 power plants. Around 100 people died. We have a power grid that was designed in the 1800s. Even the White House sees it. They're saying 2/3 of the grid are at least 25 years old, so they recently announced billions of dollars to update it. And how long will that take to actually do? That's why having your own solar power is more important than ever. With the Patriot Power Generator, you get a solar generator that doesn't install into your house because it's portable. You can take it with you and even use it inside. But it's powerful enough for your phones, medical devices, or even your fridge. And right now you can go to 4patriots.com and use code STREET to get 10% off your first purchase on anything in the store, including the Patriot Power Generator. You'll also get their famous guarantee for an entire year after your order, plus free shipping on orders over $97. And a portion of every sale is donated to charities who support our veterans and their families. Just go to 4patriots.com and use code STREET to get 10% off. That's 4patriots.com. Use code STREET to get yours today. So now it is time for our interview with Tudor Dixon. While covering the biggest names and events in politics throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, Tudor saw her own community and family suffer from the heavy-handed, cruel lockdowns of far-left leaders like Gretchen Whitmer. Seeking to repair her state from the enormous economic and personal damage done by those policies, Tudor entered the arena as a conservative outsider, winning the Republican gubernatorial nomination and ultimately becoming a leading conservative voice throughout the Midwest. Tudor is back in the media space now with her own podcast, the Tudor Dixon Podcast, part of the Clay Travis and Buck Sexton Podcast Network. You can find out more information at TudorDixonPodcast.com. Tudor, welcome to Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I know Alfredo's been on with you on your show in the past. If viewers want to check out your podcast, where should they go?
Yes, it's the Tudor Dixon podcast, anywhere you get your podcast. We also have a website, tudordixonpodcast.com. Thank you so much.
Why don't we start with just sort of what made you run for governor of Michigan?
Sure, absolutely. Yes. So my background is manufacturing, and I think that's why we have always had a great connection with Job Creators Network, because we were a small business and we understand small business here in the state of Michigan. So having worked with my father for many years in our own steel foundry, that was really kind of a point where I know that the three of us have always connected on that issue. And that was really, really what drove me. That in addition to being a mom of four school age kids, we were watching the races. As you said, I had left manufacturing. I was in conservative media, and we were watching everything that was going on in 2020. And it was suddenly shocking, the shutdowns that were happening in the state of Michigan. And we were watching the differences between like a Michigan and a Georgia, or a Michigan and a Texas, Florida, all of the states that started to open back up and say, we have to focus on the economy and public health. These things have to happen at the same time. It can't be that we shut off one to protect the other. We can protect both at the same time. But that wasn't happening in Michigan. We also had the situation where we are suddenly having all of our elderly be put into these nursing homes with COVID. My grandmother was in a nursing home at the time, and we were suddenly shut off from her. So we ended up losing my grandmother and having to say goodbye through a window. That was kind of the turning point. My kids were out of school. We were seeing small businesses struggle. We were saying goodbye to my grandmother. And we said to the folks in Lansing, our capital in the state of Michigan, who is going to run for governor? And there wasn't someone stepping up. And really, throughout my race, we never had someone who had been elected who stepped up into the race and said, I want to run. So it was sort of unique that there wasn't really a deep bench on the Republican side in the state of Michigan. Now, we did end up having at one point 12 candidates, but none of them had been previously elected officials. So it was an interesting race. We knew that we had to go up against someone who was an incredibly strong, well liked on the Democrat side. She was the vice chair of the DNC. Currently, she is a co-chair of the Biden campaign and vice chair of the DNC. So we knew she was powerful from that standpoint. But I also knew that what she had done to the state of Michigan was so severe. So we started talking to folks across the state. We had the one restaurant owner who had been shut out of her restaurant, then arrested and literally put in jail by the attorney general for 3 days for a misdemeanor. And it wasn't just jail. She was in jail with chains and shackles. She had her hands and her feet bound with chains in between them and chains around her waist. I mean, this was outrageous when you think about how can this actually happen in the United States of America. And so we said, this is, maybe it takes a businesswoman who has kids in school, who's dealt with some of the effects of her shutdowns and, understanding what it was like to lose someone through COVID. And that was sort of what led us to launch the campaign and then go on this trip that you can't imagine. I think right now, I've talked to a lot of people recently who are talking about the Senate race here in Michigan, but also races across the country. And it's just interesting because you can't tell people what it's like to run. You have to do it yourself and experience it. But man, it is a very unique experience to go through a race like that. And I look back on it and I say, it is very sad that we weren't able to defeat Gretchen Whitmer. But we did achieve some pretty interesting firsts, and that was being the first GOP nominee for governor that's a woman. Also, we received the most votes any Republican gubernatorial candidate has ever received in the state of Michigan. And so when I step back from that and I look at it, I say to myself, so what did we do wrong? And what are the Democrats doing differently? And I think this is something that Republicans across the country really need to question is, what are we doing differently that we could achieve almost 100,000 votes higher than anyone had ever received in the state of Michigan and still have Democrats come out in such high numbers, higher than they'd ever come out before too. So what are we doing wrong? And I think we got some perspective on that.
Interesting. And what do you think? What do you think some of the top line answers are there?
If you look at, so we've been very distracted by the idea that, oh, there's something nefarious going on. And whether or not there is a certain amount of fraud, there always is a certain amount of fraud in elections. But I will tell you from my experience, and I think that if we were to kind of break down races across the country, we would see this being a similar situation in like a Pennsylvania and maybe even out in Arizona. They are very effective in bringing big dollars into the state, not for their candidates, although their candidates are raising much more money than the Republican candidates. They also have organizations that are nameless and faceless. And I say that because we tend to have organizations where they have a leader, we lift them up, they go to conferences, they become a spokesperson. The Democrats don't want you to know their organizations exist, which I think is very interesting. So in the state of Michigan, we have about 15 of these. For example, in northern Michigan, there was one called We the People that just formed in the last couple of years. And they not only had their candidate on their payroll, it looks like on their payroll, they also were run completely by illegal aliens. And the idea behind it was, if you get this Republican seat to turn blue, then we'll be able to get you driver's licenses. And so they brought in, on this message alone, they brought in about $10 million. It looks like at least 6 went into just one state house district. So you think about that. That's a pretty small area for that kind of money to come in. And then what they're doing is they're not having rallies. They're not going out there and they're not attacking. In some cases, they may be attacking the right or the candidate on the right. But what they're doing is they're sending out messages through your phone. So they're targeting you, whether you're browsing the internet, you're suddenly getting an ad that you weren't expecting to get. They're targeting you based on your zip code or the area that you're in. And they're getting those messages directly to you. So you don't even feel it, right? It doesn't feel like a political ad. It feels like a message that's coming to you, whether it's a text message, whether it is an ad. It's just affirming how you feel in a way like, and this person agrees with you, or telling you this is such an awful person and this is how they feel about something. And you're like, oh, I don't want to be associated with that. On the Republican side, we are not targeting people like that. And that's what we absolutely have got to start doing. I love the fact that people put out tweets saying we've got a lot of people coming to rallies. But you know what? In the state of Michigan, I could have a rally with 1,000 people and it's still a population of 10 million. So you've got to be able to target people. We have the capability of getting right to their phones and essentially right into their heads. And we're not doing that, but the other side is.
So how do Republicans communicate that message out to other states and Senate seats and congressional districts? Because it's the communication and getting that message out on what needs to be done and how to do it. I know I saw Laura Ingraham on a few weeks ago, and she said that Republican donors need to wake up and understand they can't just fund candidates. They have to fund these outside groups that do a lot of the heavy lifting on educating voters and, getting the vote out in general. And that's what's not happening on the conservative side.
You and I have conversations about messaging, especially with the Republican Party and the lack thereof in terms of the actual messaging that needs to take place. And so you also had some great thoughts on that as well.
Right. We do have some groups. I think that there's sort of a misconception that the RNC can come in and play in every race. And so I think after 22, you saw a lot of people getting angry about the RNC. And I think that some folks are not realizing the RNC is not going to be able to come in and play in your state races. That's not their role. They do federal candidates. Their role is really very heavily involved in the presidential race, but they do focus on federal races. So congressional and Senate races, especially in off years. But you can't expect the RNC to be the only group that's going to come in when you're going up against the Democrats who have multiple groups. Again, I will say in just the state of Michigan, 15 groups. And in addition to the Democrat Party, in addition to the DNC. So you have to understand that we have to, as a community, talk to our donors in a different way. And this is something that Republican donors really are not used to. They haven't heard. Yeah. I've sat down with the folks in Michigan, and Alfredo, you and I have sat down with some folks just on the national scene and said, there's a different way of doing this. And
Yep.
they're starting to sort of understand. And if you can show them the Democrat playbook, which they don't hide, it's not a secret, it's right out there. If you can show them and say, we need to play on the same, we need to be playing the same game. I mean, right now we're bringing bows and arrows to a drone war. I like to say that. And
Yeah.
people are like, why aren't we winning? I'm like, they're annihilating us. They have so many resources. And it's not just about the fact that they are getting more money, it's they have places to put it. We don't have the organizations on the ground. So if you are in your state and you want to be organized, then think about what your messaging could be. And honestly, I think we've got to start pulling out some positive messaging. Republicans need to be for something, not just against something.
Amen to that. I mean, that's the one thing that they just have never understood, that on their messaging, they just can't be like, truly, they are always that is it. They're against everything, it seems like. And the one thing though is, I think Governor Youngkin did a nice job in Virginia of actually stating what he was for and the vision for Virginia. And I think he did extremely well because of that.
I think that people mistake that, though, for being against this big education, radical indoctrination. And so that kind of if you look at what we've seen just in this presidential election, we've seen some really negative messaging coming out of Republican campaigns. And I don't think that was meant to be the case. And so I think there's a lot of confusion over what the message is right now. And a lot of, and this happened in our campaign, getting sucked into these social issues when really the majority of the country is like, what are you going to do for national security? Are we going to end up in World War III? Could we make sure that the economy is safe? Can we make sure that we continue to be the world's superpower? And I mean, Alfredo, you and I have talked about China several times. These are really big issues, and they are really big issues that the Democrats either don't understand or they don't care about. They believe that their obsession with climate is more important than going after China, whereas we, as on our side, could very easily make the argument, the true argument, that if you are not keeping China in check, then you might as well throw away everything the United States is doing on climate, because it doesn't matter how clean we are if on the other side of the world they are as dangerous as they can possibly be when it comes to pollution. And really, if you think about this, I mean, we're talking about, well, they have the most coal plants that we've ever seen. They're building new coal plants every week. We have new coal plants going up in the country of China every week. But you see John Kerry say, but they're very advanced in wind energy. They're very advanced in solar. So not only should you be concerned from a national security standpoint of what are they doing with all of this energy? Why are they suddenly creating so much energy? Yes, they have billions of people, but there's something more there. They've got to use this energy to manufacture, to build their military. They're using it to take over the world. And then there's the climate argument of they're creating it in a very dirty way. So why, as Republicans, are we not standing up and saying, wait a minute, we're actually on your side on this, but we've got to stop these negative countries from doing this.
Now, speaking of China, you actually were very vocal about a particular manufacturing entry into your state. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a company named Gotion that is coming into the state of Michigan, and not only just coming in. I mean, this company has been recruited by Governor Whitmer. She recruited them at the same time she was trying to get $100 billion project to come to the state of Michigan and lost that to the state of New York. And the reason is Michigan is just not a friendly environment for businesses right now, small or large. We have very high energy costs. We are extremely overregulated. It is very challenging to find a site in the state of Michigan to build your company and have the confidence that the state will come around to help make sure that site has the infrastructure necessary to build. And so when she lost that, she then the next day came out and said, hey, but don't worry, I've got this big company coming in from China. It'll be great. We're going to have maybe 2,500 jobs in the middle of the state. Now, the key there is maybe, because we've heard this with multiple of automotive companies we've given them lots of money, whether it is Stellantis or Ford. We've given them lots of money on the promise of a maybe. And those jobs, either sometimes we get half of them or sometimes we get them and then they lay off at a different factory in the state of Michigan. So that's the key there. But the Goshen facility to me is very scary because We've offered them $715 million of taxpayer money. So we are
Unbelievable.
paying, yes, for a company that is very
Wow.
clearly tied to the Chinese Communist Party. And so they have on their American website that there has to be a CCP headquarters on the site in Michigan to influence the grassroots. Now think about that. You're inviting the communists
Wow.
right here into the state, into a state that has probably the highest availability of our greatest natural resource, which is fresh water, because we've got the Great Lakes surrounding us. So
Right.
either you are offering that up to the Chinese, which we know the entire globe is looking for a great source of fresh water, or you are potentially putting it in danger if the Chinese decide to do something that would be environmentally catastrophic in the state of Michigan.
Right.
And we have had no environmental testing on this corporation. This is one of the, I think maybe the only time we have had a company come to the state of Michigan and the government has not required any type of environmental testing, which I think is very extremely odd. Our existing companies who want to expand, they can't expand unless they go through rigorous environmental testing. There are non-disclosure agreements signed with all of the legislators and the governor around this Goshen project. So we don't really know what they've agreed to. In fact, we don't know what they're making. They say it's a battery plant, but we don't, it's potentially battery components. What we're hearing is that these, whatever they are building there, will not go to the state of Michigan. So it's not like this is going to Ford or GM or Stellantis. This will likely be shipped overseas. So it's not helping with this whole EV movement in the state of Michigan, even though that's the way they're presenting it. It is very devastating for the state. And the other thing that I think is interesting is that you've got Jennifer Granholm, the Secretary of Energy, former governor of the state of Michigan, who shut down a very similar project in Texas because she said, we can't give a grant to a Chinese company that is clearly connected to the CCP. This is very dangerous. We're shutting this down in Texas. When asked why she didn't shut it down in Michigan, her response was, I don't have jurisdiction there. What? That's a little suspicious.
Yeah. Very typical, though, of the Democrats, just extremely hypocritical and two-faced.
Right.
Unfortunately.
Of course. But her home state.
It's unbelievable. Now, I know you kind of have started kind of a movement to try to really almost stop this investment, or is it almost too late at this point?
You know, we have highlighted what the townspeople have done. So the folks in town are very against this because it's a rural town, it's a farming town. They're very concerned about the environmental impact. They know that a lot of chemicals will be used at this factory, but we don't, again, have any insight as to how they will be dumping any of that information. So we've been highlighting their fight. But interestingly, Students for a Democratic Society have come into this area. So this is a group, one of these groups, these organizations that get a massive amount of funding from the Democrats.
Right.
In the last week, they've started knocking doors on behalf of this company. They are also connected to, I mean, they were formed by a group that was forming them to promote communism. And so it is interesting to see that this particular group has come to Big Rapids, Michigan and Green Township and has said, we are going to promote this company. So they've been knocking doors and putting out flyers saying, you know, this is xenophobic, because the argument is anytime you say that you don't want to be associated with a country who's literally trying to take you over, then you must be some sort of a racist or a xenophobe, something like that. And so that's been the argument on their side. I think the mistake that we have here, and the reason that I'd like to see more Republicans speaking out, is that we really are not talking about the fact that China has now overtaken us in many economic and military areas. They have a larger navy than the United States. They are exporting hundreds of billions more than the United States. And the United States is importing that from China. We're very reliant on China. They have increased their economic status in the world. And we know that it's not a surprise that the president of China has been working on this for years. China has a 100-year plan. I always like to say they're on like year 85. I think it's bumped up in the last few years because they've watched this Ukrainian-Russian conflict, and they're saying, okay, now we know if we go
Yeah.
after Taiwan, we can see clearly what the United States is willing to do. And so far, the United States has kind of walked the line with, we're going to somewhat protect Ukraine, and we're going to fight back against Russia. But there hasn't been a clear statement there, because I think everybody's like, do we want to get involved in this war? But the problem is that you have President Xi watching very carefully, and it's a different,
Oh, yeah.
Ukraine is a very different situation than Taiwan for the United States. People need to understand that if Taiwan gets taken over by China, that is our lifeblood for electronics, for vehicles, for everything that you use every single day. And so China's testing the waters. They're like, oh, this is great. We're watching a conflict. We can see how the world responds. And now we can just go in. They've already buzzed Taiwan several times. We know that they're willing to go in there.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy because during COVID, Tudor, I think we saw how desperately we need to fix our supply chain issues and really kind of de-link ourselves from China. And it seems to be under this administration, we're doing exactly the opposite.
It's a challenge because I think that people who are outside of the manufacturing world, they go, oh, America first, just bring it back. And that's not so easy. I mean, we don't have the factories, we don't have the facilities, we don't have the land that they have in China. And one thing that people need to understand, in China, you really have a situation where you have slave labor. And as ugly as this is, I mean, think about it. You have iPhone City in China where they have hundreds of thousands of people in this group where they're in high-rise buildings, and they go there and they live there, and they're required to live there, and they go back to see their families like maybe once a year, but they can work 10-hour shifts, and then they have to go back to their dormitory like home and stay on site. So when people say, oh, just move out of China, well, these companies have a business model that it can't be replicated. And as sad as that is, the human rights offenses are extreme.
Right.
You can't necessarily move out of there. And so we have to find a balance of bringing stuff back to the United States and finding friendly countries to work with, to partner with. And that has to be something that we're convincing American companies to do, because you're talking about anything from pharmaceuticals to iPhones to Peloton, all of those things, even your clothing. During the pandemic, when we started to suffer trying to get all of these things, we went, oh my word, we really have a lot of things in China that we didn't realize that we are married to China.
Yeah, I think the pandemic was a wake-up call in a lot of areas, not just our kids in school, but how dependent we are on China for everything, including medicine. So, thank you so much for being such a strong vocal voice for that, because I think a lot of Americans don't understand how all of it is connected and who's pulling the strings on that. And I think that's an important message to get out too. But I want to get in a little bit about Michigan. I used to live there. I've mentioned that to you before. I spent some time in Michigan, probably about 5 years. I worked for Chrysler when it was Chrysler. I came in just before the marriage to Daimler-Benz. I was there through the divorce. But I love the state. I made great friends. It offers so much from different kinds of weather, different terrain, just amazing. It's just an amazing state. And it's a very strong family oriented state. So I enjoyed that part of it. But it was a little too cold for me. So I did move back to Florida.
We've heard that occasionally.
But I get how big businesses did during COVID, but Michigan made a lot of news with how Governor Whitmer kept the state shut down for so long. What is the state of small business now? How are they doing?
Well, it's obviously rough. We lost 3,000 restaurants over the pandemic. That was quite a bit of our community. And so that just gives you kind of a little bit of insight into local communities, how they were destroyed. And that was the number one concern that I had when I went around the state, where people were like, we've lost our communities, whether it was business owners who said we don't have employees because people have left, or just folks in the community that would literally cry on my shoulder and say, bring our community back. And so you can kind of, when you look at the state of Michigan, you can kind of see those glory days, but they're not there. And it's a struggle to get businesses to come here, because if you're a small business, you're not getting incentives like the big businesses. You also can't afford the energy costs. We have incredibly high energy costs in the state of Michigan. But the state of Michigan is incredibly unique as well. And this is something that I don't think that a lot of people outside the state realize. We have I think we're the third longest coastline in the country, because we have we're surrounded by Great Lakes. We have beautiful beaches here. We have such an opportunity to boost tourism. It's very sad because Gretchen Whitmer just cut our tourism budget to almost nothing. And we have such an opportunity. If we could get some developers in here to look at the beaches, even northern Michigan, we have so many beautiful cities, but they just kind of look a little bit like you've got peeling paint. It's just a little run down. But not only do you have incredible beaches in the summer, but you have incredible skiing and snowmobiling and hunting in the winter that really doesn't compare to other states. And right here in the Midwest, I think there's so much opportunity for tourism in the state of Michigan. That's something that I feel like we can really expand in this state, similar to what Florida has been able to do. When you talk about Florida having zero income tax, it's really the benefit of having so much tourism, because when you have the tourism coming into the state of Florida, other people are paying your bills. That's something that we could have in the state of Michigan too. I'd love to see us bringing developers here, but it has to be that you have communities that have strong businesses. In the last 10 years, Dallas has been able to bring 200 headquarters to just the city of Dallas. The state of Michigan has been losing headquarters. We've also been sort of a target of the automotive industry. As much as the automotive industry has been our bread and butter industry, our legacy industry for years and years, as our energy costs have risen, as our unions have become more powerful, and now repealing right to work, you see the automotive industry looking to the South and saying, gosh, we had Ford invest $11 billion into Kentucky and Tennessee. And Gretchen Whitmer came out and said, I think we didn't know Ford was going there. I think we didn't know. This is someone who has zero connection with her legacy industry here in the state. That industry, people go, oh, that's Southwest or that's Southeast Michigan. That's where the hub is. No, the entire state supports the automotive industry. So as the automotive industry transitions south, we are seeing a lot of our small businesses say, why would I stay here? Why would I keep paying these kinds of prices to be in a state where, quite frankly, as you said, it's cold? It's hard to do business here. Let's move south. And we have a workforce in the South. People have always said, well, Michigan has a great workforce. We did, but we've seen a lot of people move out of the state, especially after Katrina. And I know this goes back a while, but you had a lot of those tradesmen say, we're going to go down south for a little bit. They found out, well, actually, we can get high wages. The weather is better. We're not coming back. We haven't recovered from that. And so not only do we have high energy costs, we have a struggle with jobs, we also have a housing crisis. All of those things together are incredibly challenging to navigate. And then you add in that we're in the bottom 5, I think, in the nation for infrastructure. Infrastructure, after Governor Whitmer in 2018 ran on fixing the damn roads, and still we're in the bottom 5 in the country for infrastructure. It's not a desirable place for businesses. And that's why you see automotive stepping out further and further outside of the state of Michigan, which is very sad.
Now, you mentioned you mentioned that right to work no longer exists in Michigan. How did that come about? Because I imagine that was a huge hit for the state.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one of those times when we have to talk to our Republican supporters and say, you really have to understand the impact of when you lose elections. We've heard the whole elections have consequences thing. We had so many supporters in Michigan who said, but how bad would it really be? And now I've gone back to talk to those same supporters, and they're like, but how would we have known that they would repeal right to work? I'm like, we all knew they would repeal right to work, but no state has done this in decades. Nobody would repeal right to work. And yet they're very good at their messaging. It's like, we want to give you work. We want to give work people who are working, the working folks, freedom. We want them to have freedom. Well, no, you're not, this isn't freedom. You're forcing them to join a union, and the unions are then forcing their businesses out of the state. And so I think that's the opportunity here in the 2024 cycle, is for the Republican presidential nominee to come back to the state of Michigan with that message that was the message in 2016, saying we will restore manufacturing in the state. These folks, they need it. This is their lifeblood. This is how they feed their families, how they put food on the table.
Well, I see why you love that great state. It's a fantastic state, having lived there. So, but in our last few minutes, I want to give you a chance to plug your podcast again. Tell us about it. Tell us about your podcast and your plans moving forward as we get forward to 2024. And don't forget to tell listeners where they can see your podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So we started the podcast after the election, and the idea behind the podcast was really to have a bunch of different voices, whether it is someone political, someone in the news. I mean, we've had an entomologist on from Michigan State University just to talk about what you can plant in your yard to take care of the honeybees in the state. And we try to cover a range of different topics, and it's just a conversation with those folks. And a lot of times we'll have folks from the opposite side to talk. We had a father on a really sad story recently, just last week, I think it was. We had a father whose son went to a friend's house, and they had an unsecured gun, and he ended up getting shot in the head and dying at just 15 years old. And so he's out there talking to people about safe storage. And it's interesting to hear, because I think that you get to hear a perspective that you absolutely are terrified of, and you might not know exists. You know, for me, I don't think about that in my house, but then I thought, gosh, I have to think about my kids going to someone else's house. And what does that mean? So we kind of dig deep into those subjects, and that's on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, anywhere you find your podcast, you can get the Tudor Dixon podcast. So check it out. It's tudordixonpodcast.com. We are very blessed to have iHeart support us so strongly. And anytime you want to check out what we're doing online, it's at Tudor Dixon on Twitter, Facebook. We're out there every day.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Tudor, and coming on Main Street Matters, America's Small Business Megaphone. Please subscribe to the show at salempodcast.com or anywhere you get your podcasts from. You can also view the videos on YouTube and Rumble, and you can go to our website, mainstreetmatters.com, and watch it there as well. Thanks again.